Breaking news. You're looking at video of one of the last times Oscar winner, Gene Hackman, a known recluse in recent years. As for the inside footage, Hackman's estate wants to block that, release citing privacy. They opened Gene Hackman's secret tunnel and then went completely silent. Federal agents breached his sealed New Mexico compound on February 26, 2025, found him dead, found his wife had been dead for a week, and then descended into a hidden passage beneath his private library that nobody knew existed. What they found inside triggered a response, so classified, so contained that months later the FBI still hasn't said a single word to the public. Not a leak, not a background briefing, nothing. That kind of silence doesn't happen when you find nothing. That kind of silence happens when what you find changes everything. The man before the mystery. Before we go into the tunnel, you need to know who Gene Hackman actually was, not the legend. The man, his barber in Santa Fe, a man named Ruben who cut hair out of a small shop on the south side of town, told a local reporter that Hackman came in every few weeks, sat in the same chair, and spent an hour talking about Hemingway novels and the Kansas weather he grew up with. He tipped double every time. He remembered the barber's kids' names, their ages, their little league teams, whether they had gotten into the school they wanted. Not the way celebrities remember things, when a publicist has briefed them. Real way, like he was paying attention, because he actually cared. At the local farmers, market vendors knew him by sight. He'd buy green chilies in bulk and joke about his terrible Spanish. A librarian in Santa Fe recalled the way he would linger after community events, genuinely interested in whatever conversation he'd stumbled into, not performing warmth, not working a room, just present and curious in a way most people with his level of fame simply aren't. Think about what that actually means. This was a man who loved the world he lived in, who chose Santa Fe because he wanted to be part of a community, not apart from it. And then, somewhere along the way, the walls went up. The cameras went in. The staff signed NDA so tight they couldn't describe the layout of the grounds. The gates got reinforced, and the man who used to joke about his Spanish at the farmers' market stopped being seen at all. People don't lock themselves away from a world they love unless something forces them to. From the French Connection to Enemy of the State, Hackman spent his career playing men, trapped inside conspiracies they couldn't escape. Men who knew too much. Men who built walls because the alternative was worse. Maybe that was never just acting. Hold on to that thought, because in a few minutes it's going to land completely differently. The breach. February 26, 2025. A convoy of federal vehicles pushed through those reinforced steel gates outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. Behind those gates sat the $4 million compound, the private estate of Gene Hackman, 95-year-old Oscar-winning actor, and his wife Betsy Arakawa, 65. Nobody had heard from either of them in days. No return calls, no staff arriving for work. Complete silence from a property that, under normal circumstances, ran like a small private installation. Here's what nobody's saying out loud. It wasn't family who raised the alarm. It wasn't a friend. It was a handyman. A man who told deputies he believed they were dead inside. The gates had to be forced. Locks cut. That alone told agents something was deeply wrong. This wasn't a property where someone forgot to check in. Everything about this compound was engineered to stay sealed unless someone on the inside chose to open it. Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa were found dead inside the mansion alongside their dog. Betsy had died roughly a week before Gene, a severe viral infection. Gene, heart failure, natural causes. Case closed on paper. The Santa Fe Sheriff's Department told the public there were no signs of foul play. But in that same statement, they admitted the scene required a full forensic search of the entire property. Federal teams, thermal imaging forensic specialists, no foul play but suspicious enough to deploy all of that. Those two things do not belong in the same sentence, and yet there they were. The timeline makes it worse. Betsy died 7 days before Gene. That means Hackman was alive in that house with his wife's body for up to a week. No call for help, no attempt to reach anyone. The alarm system was still active. The internal cameras had been manually disabled. Think about what that actually means. A man in his mid-90s, alone in a sealed compound with his wife's body for 7 days, and he never called for help. Not because he couldn't, because he chose not to. What keeps a man that silent fear duty, or the knowledge that calling for help meant letting strangers inside, and strangers would find what was underneath? The fortress above Gene Hackman's estate wasn't a home, it was an installation. Dense forest on every side, stone walls around the perimeter, motion sensors at every access point, thermal cameras, surveillance rivaling, government black sites. The staff were handpicked, vetted, and bound by legal agreements so tight that not one of them ever spoke publicly about what went on inside those walls. Decades of employees, gardeners, housekeepers, maintenance workers, and not a single leak. In the age of social media, that kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. It's enforced. And this is where it stops making sense. These weren't casual NDAs. Former employees described agreements that prohibited them from discussing not just what they saw, but the layout of the grounds, the names of any visitors, and the general daily schedule on the property building. Permit requests for the estate came back redacted. Property records had gaps no county clerk could explain. Entire pages of documentation just gone. Body camera footage released after a judge's ruling shows deputies entering the mansion. The silence is immediate. But what unsettled agents wasn't the quiet, it was the evidence that someone had been busy before they arrived. Furniture dragged across hardwood floors, books pulled from shelves and restacked wrong, drawers left ajar, a bedroom safe open and empty. Someone had been through this house in the hours before agents arrived, searching for something or making sure something was hidden. Then agents walked into the library and everything changed. The descent behind a section of wall in Hackman's private library, concealed so precisely you could stand in that room 1,000 times and never notice. Federal agents found a hidden mechanism, not a bookcase, on a hinge, not a latch behind a painting, an engineered entry point, requiring a specific activation sequence. Whoever built it wanted it, invisible to anyone who didn't already know it was there. Nobody knew it was there. Behind it, a narrow passageway, stone steps descending into total blackness. No light source, no ventilation. Just carved stone dropping straight down into the earth. The agents went down. The temperature dropped with every step. The air thickened damp, metallic, carrying the taste of rust. Their flashlight beams swept the stone walls and stopped. Here's what nobody's saying out loud. The walls were covered in deliberate markings. Not graffiti, not decoration. Precise inscriptions, carved with tools and intention, some resembling alchemical notation symbols, associated with transformation, concealment, and processes meant to be invisible to outside observers. Others resembling technical blueprints for devices that shouldn't have existed in whatever era this tunnel was built. Interlocking schematics with internal logic, drawn by someone who had real engineering knowledge and wanted no one outside that tunnel to ever understand what they had built. One forensic technician later described the configurations as engineering from nowhere. That phrase took days to land. Not engineering from an unknown country. Not engineering from an obscure era. Engineering from nowhere. Meaning whoever drew these had access to principles or methods that don't trace back to any known scientific tradition. What's on the other side of that iron door they found at the end of this passage is the part of this story nobody has been willing to say out loud. Hit subscribe and keep watching, because what comes next is the part the FBI would prefer you never heard. What the walls said. The construction itself told a story, and it is not the story anyone expected. Near the library entrance, the stonework was mid-20th century, clean cuts, industrial material, poured concrete reinforcement. But the deeper the agents went, the rougher the walls became. Hand-carved joints, primitive reinforcement tool marks from pick and chisel, not power tools. Two completely different eras of construction, layered one on top of the other. Marcus Devlin, a structural engineer based in Albuquerque, who works primarily on historical building assessments for the state of New Mexico, reviewed leaked photographs of the passage across 2 days in his office. He laid those photographs across his desk, studied them in silence, and then set them down slowly before speaking. His assessment was precise, and it was final. This wasn't built by the homeowner. The upper section was renovated, modernized, reinforced, but the core of this tunnel was already here. Hackman moved into it. He inherited it, and then spent years maintaining it, reinforcing it, and making sure no one outside those walls ever found out it was there. That is not the behavior of someone who stumbled onto an old basement. That is the behavior of someone who understood exactly what he was sitting on and made a deliberate decision to spend the rest of his life protecting it. Think about what that actually means. A 2-time Academy Award winner, one of the most respected actors in the history of American cinema. And for the last 2 decades of his life, his primary occupation, the thing that structured his entire existence, was guarding a tunnel underneath his library that nobody was supposed to know existed. Then the passageway opened, past the crates and the scattered files and the star charts carved into the stone floor. Their flashlights found it. An iron door set into the rock. No handle on the outside. No hinges visible. Just a corroded steel surface with weld marks along every seam, sealed from the inside by someone who never came back out. The lock wasn't designed to keep people from getting in. It was designed to keep something from getting out. What was waiting? The chamber itself was vast and frozen in time. Ancient wooden crates stacked against the walls. Some had collapsed with age, spilling their contents across the stone floor. Yellow documents, rusted metallic objects, artifacts that didn't belong to any identifiable era. Agents estimated the contents could take years to catalog. This wasn't a personal archive. This was an institutional collection. The scale of what was stored in that room implies that whatever organization placed it there had been operating for a very long time. One agent lifted the lid of a dust-covered box and found photographs fragile, curling at the edges. Faces no one recognized, dressed in clothing from a century past. Clandestine meetings and windowless rooms, locations and buildings and underground spaces that don't correspond to any known place on record. In one image, a group of men stood around a table covered in maps, a single overhead bulb casting hard shadows across their faces. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a date, 1937, and a single word, in a language that still has not been identified. A single word from 1937 in a language no one can place. Leather-bound files sat beside the photographs. Coded dates, redacted names. Passages describing events deliberately erased from official records. Some pages had been partially burned. Someone tried to destroy them, then stopped. Other documents bore insignias linked to organizations that officially dissolved decades ago. Organizations that, as far as any public record is concerned, never built anything, never owned anything, and never operated in New Mexico. One senior investigator who worked the scene reportedly said the volume of material was unlike anything he had processed in 30 years of federal work. Not because of what any single item was, because of what everything implied when laid out together. The floor wasn't just stone. It was marked with circular patterns, intricate, deliberate designs that from above resembled celestial maps, star charts carved by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. These patterns corresponded to specific astronomical alignments, constellations, planetary positions, orbital paths laid out with a precision requiring advanced mathematical knowledge. Whoever carved them wasn't guessing. They were mapping something or marking it for someone who would come later and know how to read it. That's the detail that keeps investigators quiet. Not the photographs, not the files, the floor. Because you can forge documents, you can plant photographs. You cannot fake the astronomical precision of hand-carved star charts that align with actual planetary positions. Someone did the math. Someone with real knowledge carved those coordinates into the stone and then sealed the room from the inside and never came back. The device the tools recovered from the crates were wrong. Completely wrong for any era this tunnel could have been built in. Engravings matching no known manufacturer or time period. Internal mechanisms requiring fabrication technology that didn't exist when this tunnel was constructed. And then there was one specific object that stopped 3 separate engineers cold. A palm-sized metal cylinder with rotating internal rings. No seams, no visible method of assembly cast apparently as a single piece from the inside out. A metallurgical feat that current fabrication techniques still struggle to replicate at that scale. 3 engineers, 3 independent assessments, same conclusion. They couldn't explain how it was made. Dr. James Whitfield spent 19 years as an FBI forensic analyst before retiring, processing classified evidence from some of the most sensitive cases in modern federal history. Cases whose file numbers still can't be spoken publicly. He is not a man given to drama or speculation. When Whitfield sat in his home office outside Washington, D.C. and reviewed the publicly available details from this case, he described his reaction simply. His voice got quieter. When an agency goes this quiet this fast, it means one of 2 things. Either they found nothing and they're embarrassed, or they found something so significant that the disclosure conversation has moved above the investigative team. I've seen both. This doesn't look like embarrassment. Think about what that actually means. A 19-year FBI forensic veteran who has processed classified evidence from the most sensitive cases in modern federal history looked at the publicly available details from this investigation and concluded that the silence surrounding it is not bureaucratic delay. It is a deliberate decision made at a level above the investigators themselves. That decision was made for a reason, and that reason is still classified. The ground beneath Santa Fe. Here's what nobody's saying out loud about the location. The territory surrounding Hackman's estate isn't just art galleries and desert sunsets. Los Alamos, birthplace of the atomic bomb, sits just down the road. The Manhattan Project. Nuclear testing, black-budget weapons research, all of it within driving distance of Hackman's front door. This is not coincidence country. This is the most classified patch of ground in the history of the United States. For decades, locals have talked about underground bunkers carved into the mesa, infrastructure built to shelter government elites if civilization collapsed. Some of those facilities are on the record decommissioned, sealed, transferred to civilian administration. Others appear nowhere. No deed, no permit, no decommission order. They simply stopped being referenced in official documents and were never referenced again. Freedom of Information requests have confirmed that extensive underground construction took place in this region during the Cold War. How extensive? The responsive documents came back with whole pages blacked out. Richard Payne retired from the Department of Energy after years working on facility assessments across northern New Mexico through the 1990s. He agreed to speak on the record, and sitting in a conference room in Albuquerque, he chose every word carefully and said what he'd clearly been holding for a long time. There are systems under those messes built to outlast the surface. Some were decommissioned. Some were sealed. Some were simply forgotten, disconnected from every official record. And this is where it stops making sense because Devlin's structural assessment of the tunnel places the original construction in the mid-20th century. Military grade. Steel rivet spacing. Matching high-security government installation. Techniques from the 1950s. A wine cellar doesn't get built like a bank vault. A storage room doesn't get sealed from the inside. What Payne is describing classified Cold War infrastructure, quietly disconnected from every official record, matches exactly what agents found underneath Hackman's library. It means Hackman may not have built the secret. He may have inherited a secret that was already decades old when he moved in. He inherited it, reinforced it, maintained it, and spent the rest of his life making sure no one ever found it. And here is the question that follows from that. Who handed it to him, the neighbors? Who noticed the neighbors always felt something was wrong, not suspicion, something more specific, something physical? Margaret Calloway owned the property adjacent to the Hackman estate for 22 years. A retired school teacher, not someone given to conspiracy theories. She described what she experienced with the precision of someone who had been trying to make sense of it for a long time. Low-frequency vibrations at 2 or 3 in the morning, not plumbing, not heating. You felt it in your ribs, she said. Something industrial, something deep. She brought it up to Hackman once over the property line. She remembered the conversation because of the look on his face when she mentioned the sounds. He gave her a look she still thinks about, and then he said, "Some things are better left below the surface." She laughed it off at the time. She doesn't laugh anymore. That's the detail that keeps investigators quiet, not a general comment. And about privacy. A specific, deliberate statement. Some things are better left below the surface. From a man who had a tunnel under his library said directly to the neighbor standing above it. 2 properties east, a retired geologist named Frank Delqua independently confirmed the vibrations. Delqua spent 30 years working for the United States Geological Survey before retiring to Santa Fe. He knew what natural seismic patterns look like, and he knew what he was hearing under the Hackman property was not one of them. He set up a portable seismometer one summer. The readings were rhythmic, mechanical something running down there on a schedule. He filed a noise complaint with Santa Fe County in 2019. It was never followed up on. Others described unmarked trucks arriving after dark and leaving before dawn. Faces hidden, no invoices, no logos, no trace. Several neighbors independently described the same pattern. Vehicles appearing in the early hours, parked inside the tree-lined near the rear of the estate, gone before sunrise. County records show no permitted work during those periods. No contractor ever filed a receipt. During renovations that first exposed the tunnel entrance, workers found a secondary communication line hardwired into the estate's walls, wiring predating modern telecom by decades, connecting the main house directly to the chamber below. Still functional, still maintained, not a relic, an active line. Who was on the other end? The final descent. He died of heart failure at 95. Plausible. But it doesn't explain why a couple with access to the finest health care in the world isolated themselves completely in their final days. No doctor calls, no emergency contacts, no staff on the premises. The alarm system was still active. The internal cameras had been manually disabled. No record of any call made or received in the final weeks. Nothing in, nothing out. Here's what nobody's saying out loud. At some point in those final months, Gene Hackman made a decision. Not a slow fade, a decision. The outside world needed to be completely shut out. And he followed through on that decision all the way to the end. 2 people alone in a fortress, dying in silence, while something sealed 40 feet beneath them held its breath. The tunnel entrance in the library wasn't sealed when agents found it. The mechanism had been activated recently. Gene Hackman, a man in his mid-90s, a man who had difficulty walking without assistance, went down into that cold, damp passage not long before he died. He went alone in the dark. Why? What was he checking? What was he protecting, or was he hiding from something he knew had finally found him? Whatever made him descend into that tunnel in the last weeks of his life, whatever he was looking at down there in the dark, he took that answer with him. The door. The FBI has said absolutely nothing publicly about what lies beyond that iron door. No official comment, no leak, no background briefing, nothing. In an era where classified documents end up on social media within hours, that level of containment requires active suppression. That is not bureaucratic delay. That is a decision being enforced at every level of the investigation simultaneously. FBI forensic teams are still working the chamber, analyzing every artifact, Every document, every symbol on those walls. Trace DNA, cryptographic decoding of inscriptions left by hands dead for generations. Linguists, metallurgists, historians of pre-industrial engineering, astronomers interpreting star maps carved into the chamber floor. And this is where it stops making sense. Months have passed since the initial discovery. In any normal investigation, something leaks preliminary findings, an unnamed source, a background briefing someone can't resist. In this case, nothing. The information locked down around that tunnel is tighter than anything surrounding the deaths themselves. Tighter than the deaths of two people who died alone in a sealed compound with no witnesses and no staff. That asymmetry is deliberate. The FBI is not trying to explain the deaths. They're trying to contain something else. Whatever is down there isn't just historically significant. It's operationally sensitive. Dangerous enough to require full containment. Not in 1950, not during the Cold War, but right now, today, in a chamber 40 feet below a dead actor's private library in the New Mexico desert. And here is what makes that impossible to dismiss. The neighbors never stopped hearing the sounds. The underground vibrations that Margaret Calloway felt in her ribs at 3:00 in the morning. They didn't stop after Hackman died. County deputies confirmed that monitoring equipment left near the property's perimeter continued registering low-frequency readings in the weeks after his death. Something was still running. Something beneath the desert floor that does not care who owns the house above it. The machinery outlasted the man. Whatever Hackman was maintaining, whatever he was checking on in those final descents into the dark, it was still operating without him. The FBI knows this. It is why the perimeter around that property has not been released. It is why the estate's legal team is fighting in court to block any further release of interior footage. And it is why, when a federal judge asked the lead investigator whether the site posed any ongoing risk to the surrounding area, the answer given was not a denial. The answer was that determination has not yet been made. That is the sentence. That is the sentence that makes this different from every other story you have ever watched about a famous person dying alone. Because it means this isn't over. The chamber is still under active investigation. The iron door is still sealed. The inscriptions on the walls are still being decoded. And 40 feet beneath the New Mexico desert, in a tunnel that a 95-year-old man walked into alone in the final weeks of his life, something is still there. Gene Hackman guarded that door for decades. He built his entire life around it. The walls, the cameras, the silence, the legal agreements, the vetted staff, the total isolation. An existence engineered from the ground up to make sure no one ever found what was underneath. He carried that weight from the peak of his career to the final hours of his life. And he carried it alone. The man who remembered his barber's kids' names. The man who bought green chilies at the farmer's market and joked about his Spanish. The man who lingered after community events because he was genuinely curious about the people around him. That man built a surveillance installation over a classified tunnel and spent the last 2 decades of his life making sure no one got close enough to ask about the sounds coming from below. And now he's gone. Whatever was behind that iron door 40 feet below his library is no longer his to protect. The question isn't whether the FBI knows what's down there. They do. The question is what could be so dangerous, so fundamentally destabilizing, so threatening to everything we think we know, that they would rather say absolutely nothing than tell the public what they found on the other side of that door. Was he its guardian or its final prisoner? Drop your theory in the comments. And if you want to be here when the next piece of this story breaks, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next.